Welcome to Quick Take. You've said that you wrote this book for the 20-year-old version of you, offering a kind of roadmap for Indian American kids who don't want to be engineers or doctors. So who did you look to as a model when you were 20, early in your career?
Yeah, thanks, Scarlet. Thanks for having me. So you're right. I wrote this book for the 20-year-old version of me, which it doesn't just, by the way, include other Asian Americans who happen to be in their 20s, but it's really anyone in their 20s who was kind of looking towards a career or a life that might not be binary. You know, maybe somebody who had multiple interests, who views the world outside of the lens of things being mutually exclusive. And in my life, those role models were Mira Nair, the film director, who's incredible. Really looked up to Denzel Washington and Tom Hanks. There were business leaders like Indra Nooyi, who I thought were fantastic. And so there were, depending on when in my trajectory, I would look to folks and try to look at what they've accomplished in their lives. Those are some names that come to mind.
Those are some pretty lofty names. One thing I did know in your background is that you didn't go completely rogue from Indian family expectations, because you graduated from an elite school. You went to UCLA. You double majored in film and sociology. I noticed that there's no econ in there, so you didn't hedge with anything practical, which is impressive. Was a college degree non-negotiable with your family?
Well, I should point out that I did go to UCLA, but I went to their theater and film school. So whatever that means to Asian Americans, it is a top 3 program.
There you go.
I remember being on campus in the late 90s as a UCLA student and being shunned by other Indian American students on campus for not being a science major. And to your point, I did fail statistics twice in college. But yes, one of the reasons that I wanted to go to UCLA was that the more holistic approach to learning, especially as an artist, was something that was important to me. You know, I took pre-med classes as an elective. Didn't do too well in them, but I did them because I wanted to get that perspective on what it was like for somebody who was going down that path in their lives and how to bring those stories to life when I ultimately would become an actor. So I don't know that it's not that college was non-negotiable. It's that the story is, and I talk about them in the book quite a bit, but my grandparents marched with Gandhi in the Indian independence movement, and their views, particularly for the time period, were incredibly progressive. They were very secular. It was non-negotiable that their daughters all went to not just college, but to graduate school to the extent they were both, on my mom's side especially, they were both teachers. And so it was less a question of, I think, the way that we think of it as, Asian American parents who are part of that post-65 group pushing their kids towards something. And it was much more of like, well, grandma and grandpa who fought for freedom, literally were jailed and beaten by British soldiers, know what the value of education is. And that's why we want you to get a higher education. So it was a little bit different outside of that framework.
How much support did you have from them in experimenting and studying theater, for instance?
Yeah, there were a number of tacit support stories that I remember, and I'm so glad that I talked to them through writing the book to make sure that I kind of checked in with them and said, what was it like for you? That post-65 wave of Asian American immigration, a lot of folks forget, we don't often talk about, that was really to fill labor shortages in things like medicine and engineering that existed in the U.S. There weren't enough American-born folks entering those professions, and so my parents and their friends coming to America, having that opportunity to tackle the American dream because of that immigration law changing, meant that inevitably, what they knew as success were those fields. So of course they're going to push their children into those fields. Yet I still remember, the day that I was supposed to audition for UCLA's film school, there was a big snowstorm in New Jersey where I grew up, and the trains getting into Manhattan where I had my audition were totally stopped. And my dad said, "Get dressed, I'm taking you." And I knew that he and my mom probably would have preferred that I don't even apply to theater or film school, but also saw that they moved halfway around the world when they were in their early 30s. And I knew that he saw something in me that said, I at least want you to know that I'm supporting you enough to take you to that audition. And that meant the world, and it's not something that I certainly don't take for granted now, but the 17-year-old version of you, it was definitely a sobering moment at that time.
What did your parents think of when you took on a stage name? You anglicized your name from your actual name that you're born with, in part because it helped get you more roles. Did they understand that, or were they a little hurt by that?
No, I think, the practical thing about immigrants is they're going to tell you to do whatever you got to do to make it, right? And in my case, having a screen name came out of a kind of a ridiculous conversation with some college friends at 2 a.m. when I was at UCLA, and they said, what about a screen name? Consider a screen name, Whoopi Goldberg, her name is not Whoopi Goldberg, it's Karen Johnson. I said, well, I didn't know that. And then I started thinking about it. I said, okay, of course her name's not Whoopi Goldberg. And they said, could you imagine if she went by Karen Johnson? It just wouldn't be as memorable. So around that time, I was getting new headshots as an actor. I was still looking for an agent to represent me. I changed the name on the new headshots. And within a couple of months, I did have an agent who expressed interest, a wonderful woman named Barbara Cameron, who took a chance with me. And the conversation with the parents was really just, well, if you're playing characters for your life, I mean, you do what you got to do to get in the door. I think maybe it would have been different if I had legally changed my name. It might have been different. Their background was a little different, but they were very practical about if you're pursuing something that the odds are really against you, kind of do what you got to do business-wise to open that door.
I love that. If you were starting all over today, would you take on a stage name or would you use your real name?
Well, what's so wonderful about how much the industry has changed in the last 20 years is that's almost an irrelevant conversation now, right? And I would credit a lot of the streamers, frankly, the Netflixes and Hulus and Amazons of the world, the type of content that they're creating is content that you never would have seen 15 or 20 years ago. So it wouldn't have probably even been a conversation today where I could have maybe focused a little more on the things that I love about the business of the arts rather than focusing on some of the externalities. And that's kind of a wonderful sign of progress, I think.
Yeah, and you'd have a lot more vowels in your name as well. How has your thinking on representation evolved? I mean, you took the role of a teenage terrorist in 24 because it allowed you to do new things, like blow things up, for instance. Do you have any regrets about that now?
No, I think, look, the nice thing about how much the industry has changed, and I would say this goes well beyond just Hollywood, but if you look at our politics or the changing nature of even activism or business, things are stronger now because of that aspect of diversity. And of course, there's a value of diversity for the sake of diversity. And it's nice to have representation. And it certainly makes the 14-year-old version of a kid like me who never saw himself on screen feel like you have boundless possibility. But it also makes tremendous business sense. The world is changing. The types of markets that businesses are trying to enter into, this obviously goes for media and streamers especially, but overall, it's much more diverse. The purchasing power of groups that 15 or 20 years ago, you never would have even of. I remember interning at a production company. I tell the story in the book, but interning at a production company and having a boss say, "Why are you bringing me Asian names for actors for my movie? Asians don't watch movies." And I looked up the studio at the time, and there was an asterisk next to Asian Americans. Now, that asterisk was not because we collectively don't see movies. It was because nobody was asking Asian Americans what kinds of movies they see to begin with. And now that those questions are being asked, we see that Asian Americans on a whole are on par with white Americans in terms of their purchasing power, right? Obviously, that's once you disaggregate that, the data looks a little bit different here and there. But those are the things that we're dealing with now, where I think businesses and the business community realizes what a value it is and what a missed opportunity it would be to not lean into diversity of content for the sake of business and also just for the sake of it being the right thing to do.
Yeah. Although the profit motive is a big driver for that. I want to turn now, Kal, to politics, because outside of acting, you do use your real name. So you were Kal Penn Suresh Modi when you worked at the Obama White House and when you campaigned for him to become president. How did was that the goal to work at the White House after you began campaigning for him? Is that what you envisioned?
It wasn't the goal. And fun fact for those of you who are tracking the name, when you go through your FBI background check, you got to use your legal name. So I was happy to do that. But I did have to tell them that I acted in some stoner movies as part of the background check, and they seemed okay with that. But no, look, the goal was never to work at the White House. I joined the Obama campaign when he was, I think, something like 30 points down in the polls coming out of the summer of 2007. I joined that fall. And the idea there was just, this was one of two candidates who wasn't taking federal lobbyist money. I believe the only other one at the time was Ron Paul. And Obama aligned a lot with my politics and my beliefs. And initially I just said, I'll help you volunteer for a weekend. I went out to Iowa before the caucuses and really fell in love with the types of people that I was seeing, the kinds of conversations that were happening at a grassroots level. A lot of it reminded me of stories that my grandparents had told me. A lot of it was obviously new and being around a diverse, dynamic group of people that was not my experience in Hollywood. He ends up winning the Iowa caucuses, and then I had the chance to go to 26 other states, worked on the Arts Policy Committee and a number of other things that then led to an unlikely job at the White House. And at that point, I applied for it online like a dummy, not realizing that I should really take advantage of my networks. That's a lesson learned. But coming from the acting world, I really had no idea that you really need to lean into all of the relationships you have to make it work. But look, at the end of the day, having the chance to work on outreach teams around the Affordable Care Act or the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell or student loan reform was incredibly meaningful. And it was a wonderful sabbatical.
Yeah, got to leverage all the networks and all the names that you've collected over your career. So Asian Americans, we know, are the fastest growing minority group, and politicians are really now starting to appreciate the voting power of this group, this population. What do you think, given what you've seen in your time in politics, is the biggest misconception about how this group participates in the political process?
Yeah, I think by far the biggest misconception of Asian Americans is that they're a monolithic group. You know, we all come under this umbrella of Asian Americans, but really when you disaggregate what the community is, it's 50 plus subgroups, numbers of different languages. You know, you couple Japanese American and Indian American doctors who may have come here post 1965 in the same category as Hmong refugees or folks who, you know, Native Hawaiians, for instance. And so in order to really be effective at outreach to that community, you kind of have to disaggregate the data. That's something that we did when I worked on the White House initiative for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the White House. And the way of putting that together, I remember, you know, I did share this story in one of the chapters because I didn't fully even appreciate, you know, we put something like that together thinking this is the right thing for policy, it's the right thing for Americans of every walk of life. And then when you put a piece of legislation like that, or sorry, piece of an executive order like that in, you know, it was a couple of months later that the BP oil spill in the Gulf happened. And there was a lot of focus on fishing communities, as there should have been, but very little focus on Vietnamese Americans and how many Vietnamese American fishermen there were who didn't speak English as their first language. And had the federal government not, you know, had President Obama not signed this executive order, the federal government really wouldn't have been able to release resources targeting that particular community. And then again, similar to the diversity conversation we just had, obviously there's a moral imperative there, but there's also an economic component to it. The fishing industry was devastated by that spill in certain communities. And so to be able to fix that for the moral imperative of taking care of our fellow Americans and for business reasons, I think the big misconception, to answer your actual question, is it's all one monolithic umbrella. And we know from experience that it's really not. I
mean, even if you look at the Indian American community, you're a Democrat, you've been a Democrat your entire life, but there are plenty of Indian Americans who are Republican and support, for instance, Donald Trump. Likewise, in the Vietnamese American community as well. You just can't put it in one bucket or the other. Going forward, Kal, what's more likely, do you think? Another Harold and Kumar film, or you're campaigning for a President Kamala Harris?
You know, what I think what's amazing is we live in a country where both are possible. That is literally the point of the book that I had the chance to write. So it's look, I've never viewed my career choices as mutually exclusive. I have the blessing of fans who have been willing to see my movies and watch me on TV and buy the book and audiobook. And so I would hate to say one is more likely than the other. I will tell you for a fact that we are hoping to get another Harold and Kumar movie off the ground in the next couple of years. I know the whole team has been really busy on our other projects. I know nobody's announced their run for the next election cycle, so take that what you will.
Wait, Harold and Kumar are going to be middle-aged men. What are they going to be doing now?
Well, they have to have kids, right? There has to be a kid component to it, but we'll see. We're all ears. The guys who created the franchise, John Hurwitz and Hayden Schlossberg, have been really busy with their incredible series Cobra Kai for Netflix.
Yeah.
John had his own Netflix show that he just got back from. They were shooting in New Zealand. I've been busy writing this book, and I was on Designated Survivor for a couple of years. So I hope that we come up for air in a sense that we can make it soon, because look, playing Kumar is way cooler than I'll ever be in real life. So I would feel fortunate playing Harold and Kumar 69 when I'm 120 years old if I live that long.
Looking forward to that one. There's a labor shortage right now. We talk about this all the time on Bloomberg, how there are more jobs than there are workers available to fill them. Do you see that happening in show business for people like you, for Asian American actors?
I think you ask any performer, and this goes for Asian Americans certainly, but across the board, there have always been a plethora of artists vying for really just a handful of roles. That was another actually big misconception in Hollywood, even within the industry, that especially if you're looking at network TV and the more archaic forms of how we tell stories, the belief that, well, where are we going to find actors who are like this, or where are we going to find diverse writers? I remember 2 seasons ago, I co-created a show called Sunnyside about young immigrants in Queens here in New York. And it really wasn't difficult to create the most diverse writers' room in network TV history. We did it by asking and asking agents and managers especially, don't just send us your most expensive clients who have
Yeah.
been on shows before. Send us your new up and comers. We were looking at stand-up comics and people who hadn't necessarily had their shot before, and they are wonderful. And we had an incredible writers room because of it. So it's one of the things that I think the opportunity here is really to look in places that we haven't traditionally looked as business folks.
Love that. I want to end on politics here because there are a lot of young people who feel betrayed by their elected officials right now. What would you say to them to encourage them to keep the faith and not turn cynical?
Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, the system is almost it is designed in a way to make you feel complacent. Oh gosh, well, does my voice actually matter? I'm disappointed by somebody. I'm not getting 100% of what I want. Those are all rational feelings. I think the real shame is that and I'm guilty of this myself, you send that nasty tweet about something political, it feels amazing, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle. Government operates slowly on purpose. The first thing I can think of, most recent example, my friend Zoran Mamdani, who was on a hunger strike for 15 days outside of de Blasio's office here in New York City, to convince the city and convince the mayor to serve as guarantors for cab drivers who were in debt. Had been driven to suicide because of that debt. I mean, the city was really responsible for orchestrating their situation to begin with. And finally, after 15 days, the mayor thankfully relented, which we're really thankful for. But I look at somebody like Zoran, I look at this next generation of leaders, and frankly, you could apply this regardless of anyone's political beliefs. They're really trying to find the pressure points that need to exist at the right time in the right place for our elected officials to act. And sometimes it's about creating the political space for them to act and pressuring them from the outside in ways that they can do their jobs better.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Final question for you. Have you been approached to run for office? What would make you consider doing so?
I got to tell you, I love what I do as an actor, first and foremost, as a writer, as an artist. I don't have any interest to run for office myself, but I'm also very excited to continue to support people who I believe in and to get out on the campaign trail for them. I'd love to have made no secret of the fact that, I'd love to segue my private sector arts career into something in the cultural diplomacy space when I retire, maybe an ambassadorship or something like that. But I don't think that I'd run for office myself.
All right, we'll look to add ambassador to your list of many, many jobs. Kal Penn, by the way, congratulations on your engagement as well as your partner.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Kal Penn is an actor and author of You Can't Be Serious, which is